Hello, everybody. My name is Paul Stronsky. I'm a senior fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace in Washington, D.C. in the Russia and Eurasia program. And we'd like to welcome you to our live virtual event on Uzbekistan's presidential election, What Comes Next? Today, I'm joined by Edward Lemon of the Oxus Society and Texas A&M University, who will be my co-moderator. And we'd also like to thank our co-sponsors for this event, the University of Southern California and the Oxus Society for Central Asian Affairs, as well as our live YouTube audience. Feel free to pose your questions, comments to us via the live chat on YouTube. Now, we have a very distinguished panel of people and regional experts with us today. I'm going to quickly introduce them, and then we'll move into our discussion. First, we have Nabahar Imamova, who is actually in Tashkent right now. She's a prominent Uzbek journalist at the Voice of America with years of experience, covered Central Asia and the U.S. for nearly 20 years on radio, TV, and online. And she's the first U.S.-based accredited correspondent in Uzbekistan. We have Jen Murtazashvili, who is the founding director of the Center for Governance and Markets at the University of Pittsburgh. She's an associate professor at the Graduate School of Public and International Affairs, also at the University of Pittsburgh. And happily, she's also now a non-resident scholar in the Asia program with us at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, and we're really pleased to have her join the program. We have Steve Sverdlow, who's a human rights lawyer and associate professor of practice of human rights at the University of Southern California. He's the author of the recent U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom, Uzbekistan's Religious Prisoners, Addressing a Legacy of Repression, that came out just a few weeks ago. And finally, we have Timur Umarov, my colleague at our Carnegie Moscow Center, who is a expert on China, Central Asia, and the region. He is also from Uzbekistan. As I said, Dr. Edward Lemon will be my co-conspirator today in moderating. And we're going to forego the usual 5-minute presentations today and really try to jump into a conversation. We all know this is a carefully choreographed election. We don't need to go into all the little details about that. There's only government-friendly opposition running. The real opposition has not really been allowed to register, and Mirziyoyev will almost certainly be returned to a second term. So, we can discuss all of that, and we can discuss all of the irregularities and all the problems with the election. But we also wanted to use this event to sort of discuss Uzbekistan in general, to look at Mirziyoyev's past 5 years. What are the achievements? Where is the reform agenda gone? And where are the continued problems with that reform agenda? And as well as look at what Uzbekistan is facing now. We've seen there are tremendous economic problems in the country. There's tremendous foreign policy problems, and there's still all of the domestic political problems and the repression. So we want to have that conversation as well, to talk about what the Uzbek people need, what the Uzbek people want. So first, let me turn it to Nabahar in Tashkent. I'd like to get her sense of what she's seeing, the impressions she's getting from the ground. I'd also like to get a sense of you're there right now, and does the president need to actually manipulate this election? How popular is he? Nabahar, please.
Hello from Uzbekistan. It's great to join everyone from Tashkent. It's a very interesting time. Interesting in a sense that, as you just said, Paul, President Mirziyoyev is incredibly popular, not just here around the capital, but across the regions. And I have actually been covering these elections from the January of this year. That's when I actually started interviewing people, relevant folks here in Tashkent about the upcoming elections. And then what I was hearing from the Uzbek lawmakers, from policymakers, that there will be no puppet candidates this time. It's impossible. The Uzbeks won't take it this time. We will see a very vibrant campaign. It'll be an unprecedented event. You will see, we will start doing all of that in July. We'll follow the legal procedures. The presidential campaign starts at least, 3 months before the voting day. So everybody relevant to the election sounded very promising and very confident. Now, come July, and I was here late June, we were still not hearing anything about anybody. Like, we didn't know who was running against Mirziyoyev, and President Mirziyoyev wasn't really saying anything about the upcoming elections. And it got a bit active late July, and I was here in September. Again, very little talk, very little discussion about the upcoming elections. And I've been here now for 4 days, and I started the coverage of this, election campaign in rural areas, because I wanted to find out what ordinary folks, rural populations, rural voters are thinking about. And what's interesting is that there's a certain pride about voting now in Uzbekistan. Uzbeks are going to vote, and about 20 million people in Uzbekistan are eligible to vote. And wherever I go, especially to voting centers, they're all prepped, they are all ready logistically, they have taken care of everything. They have, special spots for journalists, for international observers, for anybody, they have even spots that says for international correspondents, in rural areas. So they're really hoping to see some media representatives there. So logistically, it's all ready. And then when you engage people, when you ask them who they're going to vote, you hear Mirziyoyev. So the conversation starts with Mirziyoyev, ends with Mirziyoyev. And what's interesting is that a lot of people who are not fully satisfied, or even remotely, satisfied with his policies, there are many people in the villages who told me, those changes that President Mirziyoyev have been talking for years now haven't come to our villages yet. Look at our roads. Look, we still don't have a hospital that we need for like 50, 60,000 people here. Look at our schools. Look at our kindergartens. Look at everything that we have. It's all, some places were renovated the last time, 30 years ago. But we still think that President Mirziyoyev is the guy who will bring about those changes. We don't see anybody else in the field. And when I ask about those four parties who are also, offering their nominees, people have very little information about them. They haven't met them. They haven't seen them. And what's really lacking in the picture of this pre-election Uzbekistan is that voters in this country have not seen the presidential candidates together at all. And there have been zero interaction between them. Yesterday, there was a debate on state television with the special representatives of each candidate. And it wasn't even seen as a, news event. Forget about it being a major news event. Nobody here in Tashkent was talking about it today. And I spent my whole day with journalists again, with authorities, with policymakers, with parliamentarians, and even they're not talking about that debate. So what is really missing is that. Otherwise, there is a certain level of excitement. Uzbekistan went from a country where no problems were discussed publicly or privately, even off the record, to a society where problems are discussed all the time. Wherever you go, people are free. They feel free enough to be engaged, and they're very vocal, and many are very dissatisfied with this system. They constantly, express their grievances. And we know that President Mirziyoyev has been traveling around the country, and he's been hearing a lot of that as well. And of course, he's promising to fix them, and he's promising to, help people, and he's promising to not change the course. He's promising to complete the reform process. One interesting incident, let's say, or maybe exchange that we have seen so far that was remarkable in a sense that, in this picture of a lot of ingredients missing, one of President Mirziyoyev's rivals, so-called rivals, the National Revival Democratic Party's candidate, Kadyrov, MP and the vice speaker of the Uzbek parliament, he said something about, he was talking about migrant workers in Russia and other countries. And, labor migration is a big issue here in this country. And a lot of voters really discuss that when we ask questions. They see that as one of the major issues. So Kadyrov basically said something like, well, migrant workers abroad should pay income taxes at home. And the next day, then President Mirziyoyev addressed that issue, and he expressed his views where he said, well, that's really wrong. We shouldn't be taxing them, and I would never do something like that. So that created a little excitement, maybe for a day. But other than that, there are no heated discussions here. And you see that void because people are open to discuss these issues. People want to see not necessarily controversy, but, you know, that interaction. They want to see candidates and they want to see them debating with each other. And 4 days from the elections, it's missing, and that's what's making these elections sort of boring. You know, I keep on comparing everything to what I saw in the parliamentary elections in 2019. Their political parties were more vibrant, they were dynamic. We saw live shows, we saw debates, and all of that, and none of that is happening this time.
So this is really a sort of a big difference from the previous one, and also, you know, we have seen both on social media, we've seen Uzbek citizens voice their discontent at local officials, but it doesn't seem like, at least in this process right now, that these, you know, higher level officials, president and the other candidates, want to really engage on those issues. You know, maybe I'll turn it over to Ed. And
just wanting to turn the conversation to Steve next. We had various high-level delegations from Uzbekistan visiting the United States recently, and we've also had high-level delegations from the United States visiting Uzbekistan. And very much the framing there is that this is a referendum on Mirziyoyev's reform program. Mirziyoyev obviously came to power 5 years ago. Quite a lot has changed in the country, as Navnahor has just alluded to. But your recent report, published last week, if I'm not mistaken, points to continuing human rights challenges. In particular, the report points to 2,000 individuals who are still imprisoned on charges of religious extremism. So, you know, from your lengthy experience working on human rights issues in the country, you know, what has changed in the country, what's improved, and what challenges remain?
Thanks, and it's really great to be with Timur, Jill, and Navnahor, and Paul, and yourself, Ed. Thanks guys for getting together for this discussion. I like what Navnahor was just saying, that she just summed up this election campaign as sort of boring. I think, unfortunately, that is true. And in some ways, it represents that this election is really a missed opportunity during which the government could have channeled this dynamic energy that we've seen in the media sphere. And as Navnahor was just explaining, this movement in the population, this desire for improved social and economic conditions, this increased social activity, even sometimes protests that we've witnessed over the past 5 years. I think these elections were an opportunity to channel that energy, that more of that dynamism that we've actually seen over the last 5 years, and channel it into further improvements or reform, which unfortunately is not happening. And I agree completely with what Navnahor was saying. I think there's, as we've been witnessing, I think more or less since the beginning of the pandemic, we've seen these authoritarian habits creeping back in stronger and stronger. We've seen more and more backsliding. We've seen a Rubicon crossed in the last year with a few high-profile cases that should worry us greatly. One was a blogger who writes about corruption, Atabek Satori, was put in prison for 6.5 years this spring. We also saw these really troubling incidents that included a lot of homophobia, but resulted in a blogger, a satirical blogger named Miraziz Bazarov, being placed under house arrest, being attacked, and then placed under house arrest and charged with slander. And we've seen some other events like that. Also, female journalists. Maybe I'm starting with media because I think it's at the core of this. We've seen female journalists harassed and threatened over the past few weeks, even and months. And of course, as Navnahor was saying, opposition candidates barred from participating in these elections, despite some high-level rhetoric that seems to support opposition. Now, the OSCE election mission, which is in the country, includes 250 observers. I wish I could ask them right now what they're witnessing, what they're saying, but we know from their official statements, again, they agree with this assessment that there's been no direct or meaningful engagement, no debates. And I think I've made that continual recommendation to the government over the past few years that we would like to see President Mirziyoyev regularly taking critical questions at press conferences from journalists, which he hasn't yet done. And I think the lack of debates is really a real problem. And it stands in contrast with these more vibrant elections in 2019. Now, as to the report and the findings of that report, that's even more troubling. And I would say, what we revealed in the report by the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom was that authoritarian core of the system, the criminal justice system in Uzbekistan, the prison system in Uzbekistan, and actually the approach to dissent, the counter-extremism policies, those still remain largely in line with what Islam Karimov erected and constructed many, many years ago. And that's why you still, unfortunately, have such a large population of people languishing in prison who shouldn't be there. And so, one of the key findings there, and we tried to show these 81 cases to represent that these are peaceful individuals, some imprisoned for longer than Nelson Mandela, who should have their cases examined. And I hope that happens as part of this ongoing process. If Nabahor is right, or I should say, if what Mirziyoyev is promising, that he will continue the reform process, is really true, then of course, I hope we're going to see people released from prison, including the blogger that I mentioned, and some of these other cases dropped, more support for the media, and a recommitment, or as I've called it, a Navruz is what's needed, a renewal of this discussion of reform, a renewal of the commitment to human rights. Otherwise, what we're seeing right now in these elections is sort of boring, as Nabahor said.
Yeah. Steve, if I could just follow up with a quick question. I mean, the OSCE ODIHR is there. That's kind of an unprecedented, move. It's a surprising move. But at the same time, we're not seeing, and we've seen this tremendous courting of Washington. I mean, so many Uzbek delegations have been here, or they've invited, prominent or sometimes not so prominent Congress people to Uzbekistan as well, to sort of highlight this country has changed. So why does Uzbekistan want ODIHR here if this election is just going to be, same old and boring and a missed opportunity?
Well, it's not same old. I mean, certainly the levels of engagement are greater, and I think the political, at least others might speak to this, but I think the political elite understands that more engagement leads to more benefits in terms of Uzbekistan's image, but also, of course, there is more of an acceptance of the idea of criticism. I mean, the very fact that I was, of course, able to freely do such sensitive research over the past few years, I think shows that there is an increased tolerance, at least, or a much more sophisticated understanding of the need for engagement. And of course, that's an improvement. I welcome it. I think it's very important. But at the same time, there seems to be this anxiety. There seems to be a fear. There seems to be a resistance or a notion that once critical topics are really let out of the bag, that you could have some sort of explosive situation or a chaotic situation. And there also seems to be, at least what you hear when you speak to a lot of officials off the record, is that you'll get the explanation that there's a group of reformers and there's a larger group of folks in the system, in the civil service, in the public service, that are used to the way things were done before and might even be comfortable seeing it return to that way. I don't know to what extent that's true. That may be self-serving justification. But whatever the theory is, whatever is correct, the process is way too slow. And I think the process of reform, it's just another reason why I think the international community should not let up in terms of the expectations and the discussions of connecting human rights and reform to all these other really critical discussions about security, about regional stability, about Afghanistan that I know others will talk about. So I think there's leverage there for continued reform and progress.
And I think that's a key point, given the sort of the recent interactions, high-level interactions between the United States and the Uzbek government. Now, if we could switch maybe to Jen and get her perspectives. I mean, we've talked a little bit about the election. We've talked about the political reforms and the continued repression, and that this, in many ways, is a missed opportunity. I was wondering if you could give a sense of some of the sort of economic issues that are at stake here. I've just, recently seen, and I think, Timur even tweeted it today about the growing debt burden in the country that's just, skyrocketed. And we're seeing a lot of socioeconomic challenges. COVID is certainly one of them in the recovery, but, poverty, struggling social safety net, the rural-urban divide, So I'd really like to get your thoughts on where you think sort of the economic reform has been and where it's going and where it needs to go.
Thanks, Steve. It's a great question, and it's a real honor to be here among such esteemed colleagues. And wonderful to see all of you today. And thank you, Steve, for really organizing this and putting so much energy into bringing us together. This is, and I should say that I have sort of the brightest spot to speak about. So I want to be careful here, and the areas of economic reform, which sort of link into foreign policy, which I know Timur is going to speak about, are sort of the brightest sides of the reform process. And I want to be very careful, as I speak about some of the positive changes here, not to take those out of context in the context of the other political reforms that have taken place. But I really believe that it's the economic reforms that are driving all of this. And so when we talk about reforms and the reforms, what do we mean by that? And if we think about, the comments by Kadyrov, or Kadir, however he's calling himself these days, his comment harkened back to the Karimov era. When he talked about taxing the income of migrant laborers, this is something that Islam Karimov spoke about. And he had a very disparaging attitude towards migrant laborers. He cursed them, he criticized them. He said they were traitors. And so when he made that comment, to me, it was like a direct reminder to people of the Karimov era. And of course, President Mirziyoyev comes in and he says, no, I'm not going to do that. This is a new day. But Mirziyoyev inherited an economy with a huge population, a young population, a population that's growing very quickly. And he has to address this issue of jobs and has to address this issue of economic development. And each year there's hundreds of thousands of young people that enter the labor market. And so he has to have a response to them that isn't go to Russia and find a job and become a migrant laborer. So that, and the country's multi-vectored foreign policy, which I know Timur will speak about, really made the country very dependent upon Russia for these migrant laborers. And so many people were traveling. Of course, Uzbekistan's economy isn't as relatively dependent on remittances as Tajikistan, but the number of migrant laborers from Uzbekistan is the largest of any country in Central Asia. So that's something to keep in mind. So he's really tried to generate economic development, economic growth, and part of this is by getting foreign direct investment. So his entire model as a president is focused on being open to the outside world. So Karimov he led this autarkic system that was very inward facing, that really eschewed the outside world. Mirziyoyev's model is the complete opposite. It's let's be open, let's engage, regardless of how that engagement may turn out. Let's engage, because there's still an opportunity that the costs of this engagement are actually quite low. Karimov exaggerated the costs of this engagement. And even if we get criticized, it's okay, because we've turned a page on things. And so I think when we look at the case of the international observers there, they know what the outcome of that observation mission is going to be. And it's something that they're willing to take on. And they say, look, we engaged, we've done that. So if we look at the economic policy, though, I think there's still a lot of heartache. And I think this is where Mirziyoyev has made a lot of promises to people where he hasn't been able to deliver. And, it's really this issue of rural development is a big one. He has talked, and I've said it elsewhere, when you meet with rural officials, they will tell you that, under Karimov, you couldn't talk about problems. Now Mirziyoyev tells you to talk about problems openly, speak about them freely. But there's still this real hesitation because they don't know whether they're going to be thrown under the bus, right, when problems emerge, because still these officials are all appointed by Tashkent. Mirziyoyev talked about electing hakims. He said, this is going to be a big priority for me. We need to have local accountability. When he first came to power, he created these reception rooms, which allowed people to complain about government officials. And this was really new. So the kind of energy that we're seeing in civil society is quite amazing, I would say. Now, we're not seeing that translated into government policy with NGO registration or political party registration. But on social media, you can say just about anything. Even you can criticize the president increasingly. We're seeing this on a lot of social media groups over the past several days and months. But, of course, there's limits into what you can do in terms of formally organizing. But these promises, so he promised elections, But it was a couple months ago, the president said, you know what, we can't even elect Mahala leaders effectively. We're not going to have people aren't ready. And it really reminded us of the past. And I wonder what happened. You know, Steve talked about COVID. We saw this, I think the past 6 or 8 months, there was this real indecision about what to do about these elections. We remember Senator Safayev came to Washington a year ago, even after COVID, and said, we're going to have free and fair elections. And when he was here in Washington a few weeks ago, he really tempered everyone's expectations. And of course, those expectations have fallen quite dramatically. I think the parliamentary elections were a huge step forward for the country. You saw officials really talk about issues, and they were talking about foreign, the economy and the role of the economy, the role of Russia. We saw debates about nationalism, debates about the role of the Uzbek language. So these are really new, and I think that this reform process is going to be a long one. The economic reforms have really gone forward in many important ways, although not fully. Remember 5 years ago, there was this currency there was a black market. Now the currency has been floated, it's open, you can trade. There's capital markets now that are emerging. This didn't exist. So the country has really opened itself economically. Yes, there's debt, but I think that this issue of debt, has been debated in the newspapers, among policymakers, among academics. There were roundtables discussing this. Uzbekistan's level of debt, yes, it's higher, but compared to other countries, one of the things that I think we don't fully appreciate is the good economic shape. And I want to be careful how I say this, that Karimov left the country. There were massive gold reserves or massive currency reserves. He saved money. He didn't necessarily, the country was still impoverished, but there was a lot of money left. And so the debt to GDP ratio is extremely low compared to other countries. Now the country is taking on debt. It's engaging with its neighbors. It's opened up its borders. It's really made trade with its regional partners much easier. And it's made a lot of regional foreign policy objectives much easier because it's opened up its borders. And without Uzbekistan changing this, none of these regional projects would be foreseeable. And I know we'll talk a little bit later about Afghanistan, which is a really fascinating change that's taken place. But Uzbekistan's change in foreign policy, which is intimately related to its economic strategy, has really shifted foreign policy in the region.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting, Jen. And one of the things that I've just noticed, Deputy Secretary of State Wendy Sherman was just there. And, in the past, she'd be going to places like Kazakhstan. And I think sort of this new regional role that Uzbekistan has played, particularly given the Afghan crisis, there's a clear reason why, senior U.S. leadership is also looking now more at Uzbekistan. Now, I know Steve wants to jump in, so please go.
Well, that was fascinating listening to what Jen was just saying about the moving away from the direct election of hakims. That was one of those central aspirations that I think a lot of us were excited by. It would introduce some level of democracy into the system, more accountability. And Jen's absolutely right. I went to those reception centers after they opened in 2017. There was a lot of genuine enthusiasm about their effectiveness and this idea that officials are accountable. And Nabahor was there. I remember watching you, Nabahor, interview some of the more unpopular or controversial hakims, like Shuhrat Ganiyev, who came in for, terribly demeaning statements that he was making about the population, and just the general feeling that some of these people really embody the lack of accountability, sometimes the corruption in the system, such as the mayor of Tashkent and Ganiyev, who eventually got promoted in this past period after acting so terribly. And I just wonder, it's a question to both of you, to what extent do you think the decision not to institute those elections, and do you think generally this resistance to move away from some of the more odious figures in the political elite, do you think that has to do with a fear, again, coming from Mirziyoyev about what that would mean for his political stability? And what extent do you feel that the issue of corruption and the outrage about it is guiding things politically and internally? How do you see this playing out? Because it seems like this is where some instability is present in Uzbekistan's politics. It's to both of you.
You know what is interesting about these elections, something that we need to point out. Yes, those four candidates, other than President Mirziyoyev, are not as engaging or maybe not as dynamic, but they have been traveling around the country. They have been spending a lot of time with voters, and Uzbekistan has never seen that kind of engagement with other candidates, So they're not spending much time here in Tashkent. They're not interacting with media, but they are. So we know that from the pictures, we see them from their propaganda. But we don't know what kind of conversations they're having. We don't know what kind of issues they're addressing. So the media strategy here, or let's say the promotion strategy, something is infinitely wrong with that. So when I was talking to some members of, these five parties, including President's Party, they're like, well, for us, the priority are voters. And we are with them. We're discussing all those issues. And we're discussing corruption as well, they were saying. And they all expressed confidence that they are doing their best. And then when I was talking to some young people today, they're very diverse in their views. Some of them are incredibly critical. And some of them, these acute observers, they are making conclusions, something like, perhaps this is what Uzbekistan is capable right now. Maybe this is the extent of anything democratic we can experience right now. Maybe we're expecting too much from ourselves. Maybe we're not yet capable of running those professional campaigns. And these candidates, they represent us. And these political parties are representing the level of political activism and awareness in the country. Perhaps, they say, and these are, people in their 20s, perhaps we're really gauging too far. We're basically expecting too much from ourselves. So there are those kind of views as well. And when Paul was asking about the role of the OSCE, Paul, OSCE was here in 2019. And we saw, how they observed and the conclusions they made. And Uzbeks, from my observation, they're pretty comfortable. They're not expecting a stellar report from the OSCE. They're happy to have them because they want the world to see that Uzbekistan is open and Uzbekistan is more comfortable than ever with its shortcomings. And we tried. And, yes, President Mirziyoyev is incredibly popular because he has done all these great things. But we have other people who can also run, and we have their agenda. And what political parties in general are doing is they're using this campaign to promote their platforms and to actually register new members. That I see happening very actively. And, we need to keep in mind that altogether, the members of all these political parties, they don't even make it 1 million. The largest party by numbers is the Ecological Party, which is the most passive based on, on our observation. So when we really question the role of political parties, we're talking about very small political circles in this country. And that explains a lot of things here. People do not see political parties as change makers. They don't see them as drivers. And when you go deeper into these political parties, the ideological depth isn't there. They're very narrow and they're all very similar to each other. And somebody like Alisher Kadyrov and others, even Maksuda Varisova from the People's Democratic Party, they say, perhaps even 5 parties are too much for Uzbekistan now, because we're not necessarily bringing in any ideological diversity here. We're all similar.
Mm-hmm. And there's not been any space, right, to diversify these political parties at all. So, we began to see that in 2019. And when they had these debates, there was actually differentiation. You could see people disagreeing and they were talking about real issues. But the bounds within those disagreements, was very narrow. And I think, foreign policy, nationalism became, different economic approaches. But, back to this issue of the Hakims, what we've seen actually is a centralization of authority. A lot of authority has been taken away from the Hakims because, the president said the Hakims were involved in corruption. The Hakims are responsible for a lot of the land issues and the property confiscation. And you recall those protests that have happened. To me, this is some of the most remarkable stuff that isn't talked about enough as we consider the reforms in Uzbekistan, is the protests over land, the role of the local Hakims in all of this. There's been centralization of authority, and then COVID hit, and we didn't really hear about this for a while. And I can't help but think that the events in Belarus, the events in Kyrgyzstan, really affected the trajectory, focused people's attention back on elections, in a really negative way, because 6 months ago, even 8 months ago, there was like Atajanov, there was like stirring about the singer, Jahangir Atajanov, who gave up singing and wanted to focus on politics, and he was going to run for president, and he said he wasn't going to, under, it seemed like, pressure. He said it was pressure. But these local officials have play a key role, and I would suspect that after these elections, I would suspect if there is going to be a priority for the government, it's going to be on public administration reforms. Because what I've seen is the government take on a lot. And you remember these early years of reform, there were decrees happening like every 5 minutes, and officials couldn't keep up. And so many of these reforms contradicted one another. There was new ministries created, new ministries taken away. What does that mean for the subnational level? What does that mean for budgeting? What does that mean for execution? And then I was looking at some of these rural development programs where the government still allocates resources, using like central planning models. Like this district's going to get 2 tons of bricks, and this district's going to get, this is the way resources are allocated. So even the ambitious reforms cannot be executed given the administrative structures the country has. So this is not just a technical issue. This is a big political issue that's going to require a lot of will if the government's very serious about this.
So taking the conversation beyond Uzbekistan's borders, we can turn to Timor now. One of the signature achievements of the Mirziyoyev presidency, the first 5 years, has been his foreign policy, his reorientation of Uzbek foreign policy away from the isolationism that Jen mentioned under Karimov towards being more proactive and pursuing what could be called a region-first, Central Asian region-first foreign policy. How successful has that been? How successful has Uzbekistan and Mirziyoyev been in pursuing this multi-vector foreign policy, positive relations with Russia, positive relations with China and the United States? What's your take on the past 5 years?
Yes, thank you very much, Edward, and thank you to all. It's actually a great honor for me to be here. I also, when I was preparing for this conversation, I looked through all the presidential programs of all the candidates that are there. And interestingly for me, only Shavkat Mirziyoyev had a very detailed part about Uzbekistan's foreign policy. Other candidates were focusing on domestic affairs. And for me, I mean, it is logical, and if I try to put myself in the shoes of the political regime in Uzbekistan, I would also think that these upcoming presidential elections are not that important for the future of Uzbekistan. And I mean, it's not a surprise for anyone that Shavkat Mirziyoyev is going to stay in power and he's going to be re-elected. And he has a lot of support in the society, and this is not even a question. So I think Uzbekistan just doesn't see it's necessary to put so much effort and energy to these elections, because everyone knows what's going to happen during them. So I think Tashkent right now uses this opportunity to to look at these 5 years that has gone, and to evaluate those reforms and those changes that happened during those 5 years, and take this as an opportunity to promote the ideas that Uzbekistan has for the next 5 years. And here in foreign policy, I think Uzbekistan will be continuing what it's been doing. And I have here 3 main directions that Tashkent is going to take. First of all, of course, Central Asia and regional cooperation will be #1 priority for Tashkent. It has been for the last 5 years, and it will continue to be so. Of course, I'm not saying that creating this exclusive Central Asian mechanism without big powers was an idea of Mirziyoyev, but it's obvious that without the change of power in Uzbekistan, without Tashkent being so dynamic and so active in this regional cooperation, and this dynamism actually started as soon as Mirziyoyev came to power. He started his relations, and his first foreign tours was in Central Asia, not in other, not to other countries. So here, I think Tashkent will continue to use this as an opportunity to be portrayed as a leader of the region, and to try to make these mechanism that exists right now to come up with some tangible results. Second direction of Tashkent's foreign policy in the upcoming 5 years, of course, will be Afghanistan. Afghanistan is not going to disappear from the agenda anytime soon, and for Uzbekistan, this is a new opportunity. And actually, Tashkent is saying this out loud, that they don't see Afghanistan as a source of threat, but they see it as a source of opportunities. This is really a chance for Uzbekistan to be present in international community, to drag attention to its importance in resolving Afghan question. And Uzbekistan has been the leader and actually a unique country in the region that is promoting, engaging Afghanistan rather than kind of fearing and locking Afghanistan inside, to leaving Afghanistan to solve its own problem on its own. So this is the second direction, and the third one will of course be continuation of this economic diplomacy that Tashkent puts a very important that Tashkent sees as a very important one. And here, of course, China will be #1 partner in economic terms. We will see in the upcoming years new projects together with China, but we also shouldn't forget about Russia. Actually, Shavkat Mirziyoyev has already discussed his upcoming visit to Russia in November, and it seems that it will be the first trip that Shavkat Mirziyoyev will take during his second term as a president. I think that this meeting of Mirziyoyev here in Moscow will be very important, and many important questions like Uzbekistan's future relations with the Eurasian Economic Union will be solved during this meeting. Yeah, if you have any questions, I'm happy to answer.
Wonderful. And we have a number of questions in the chat coming through that maybe are good as follow-ups to those points you're making at the end, Timur. There's a question around the extent to which this election will affect relations with Russia. I assume from your recent comments, it's going to be more of the same. And it's symbolic, as you say, that Mirziyoyev is going to Moscow as his first visit in his second term as president.
Actually, if you remember, during the parliamentary elections, relations with Russia was a very hot topic. Kadyrov was saying that Uzbekistan never should join EU, but Mirziyoyev was not very, vocal about Tashkent's joining or not joining EU at that time. But now we see that Uzbekistan right now is a observer in this union, And it seems, actually, if you take a look at what has been happening in Uzbek-Russian relations during the last several months, you will see that they were very, very active, and many promises has been done, like new experimental projects with 10,000 migrants who will come to Russia on the intergovernmental agreement. There more than 150 migrants were, there was an amnesty that let them come to Russia, even though they were deported before. New Russian universities opened branches in Uzbekistan. Minister of Foreign Affairs Lavrov said that Russia is going to open new schools in Uzbekistan. Avtovaz, Russian car producer, has opened its factory in Jizakh. We also have seen, other, or Uzbekistan wanted to rent land in Russia. So relations between Uzbekistan and Moscow in the last several months has been so active that I think that this is the preparation for Mirziyoyev's coming in November to Moscow. And I'm not going. I don't think that elections are going to change this dimension at all.
And one big development in the region, as we discussed, is rising regionalism. There's a certain view on that creating these horizontal ties may weaken or be a strategy of balancing against external powers. Of course, this is very much the perspective in Washington, that this is something to be promoted to reduce reliance on any external partner. But what are China and Russia's views, to the extent we can understand, of the rising regionalism we're seeing within Central Asia? And as a follow-up, there is another question related, to what extent is Uzbekistan now becoming the regional hegemon as opposed to, or the leading regional state, as opposed to Kazakhstan?
May I start answering?
Mm-hmm.
Please. So I wouldn't say that there is much of a regionalism right now. We just in a moment where countries are taking baby steps towards some kind of a cooperation instead of a confrontation with each other. So it's too early to talk about regionalism, or I cannot imagine that all Central Asian states will come up with some kind of strategy towards Russia or China at this moment. But this is a very important trend, and this is a very a great trend that we're witnessing right now, that Central Asian states have started to cooperate exclusively with each other without any other countries involved. And this is important because there are so many conflicts, there are so many problems inside Central Asia that were inherited from Soviet Union, and that first of all, I think number one priority for this cooperation is to solve them, and only after that talk about some kind of a united strategy or standing towards Russia or China. So at the same time, I think Moscow and Beijing understand that for now it's not something that that they can see as a threat to their influence over these countries, and that is why we don't see these two big powers putting obstacles to this regionalism. They actually try to engage Central Asia in their own formats. China has created its own Central Asia +1, as well as Russia. So they're using this strategy to, stay as where they are right now, and yeah.
Jen, did you have any other comments?
Russia is, just saw a report, 1 million people. Russia's lost 1 million people in this past year. Its labor market is just not in a good place. So it, just as much as Russia thinks it needs the Central Asian republics and Uzbekistan, it can have leverage over it. I think the Central Asian republics are actually have a very strong position vis-a-vis Russia. So I think we see that the ground being laid. Russia is doing quite a lot to make this very appealing for Uzbekistan to join the Eurasian Economic Union. But I just can't help but wonder, when we saw so much of this backlash that Timur mentioned with the parliamentary elections, this discussion of the Uzbek language that we've seen over the past 18 months as well, this rising Uzbek nationalism that didn't really exist in the way that it did, under Karimov. It seems like this is an asset that the government has or somebody has in order to really serve as a buffer against the Eurasian Economic Union. I can't imagine that if an announcement was made, it almost seems politically unfeasible given the domestic political terrain to join this union, despite sort of the economic attractiveness that it may have for Uzbekistan.
Nalhar, do you want to jump in?
Yes, very briefly. So, just like the United States, Russia and China and other Uzbek partners are very confident that Mirziyoyev is going to continue. He's got at least another 5 years under his belt. So looking at everything from here in Tashkent, they're not really expecting major changes in the relationship. But I think the biggest challenge for Uzbekistan short term in its foreign policy is its tight relationship with the Taliban and the extent that, Tashkent can play a positive role in pushing for positive changes in Afghanistan. How is it going to navigate the relationship, the relationship between the international community and Afghanistan? Will it push or will it convince the Taliban to take the kinds of actions that America wants it to take and others? So here, not much discussion about Uzbek foreign policy ahead of these elections, of course, because we're not really interacting with the nominees, because I would love to hear their takes on this. And I know that there are some really vibrant conversations going on, but really in very, very small circles. But in general, based on everything that we know so far, based on my coverage of Uzbekistan for the last 3 years, that, anything major is going to happen in Uzbekistan's foreign policy, let's say, a year or 2 years from here. So they're watching, obviously, and the most interesting thing about these, the fact that this is a boring election campaign is the most interesting thing about this election campaign, So what really matters, and what I've been hearing from you, Paul, and from others in Washington as well, is that it's not that these elections really matter. It's what happens after, right? What happens 5 years from now? What will Mirziyoyev do? I think that's where people will be trying to sort of re-strategize their relationship, or maybe worry, somewhat about their ties with Uzbekistan. But for now, I think everybody feels confident enough that Mirziyoyev is going to be around and will continue with the kind of pace we have. And I think in many ways they're happy with Mirziyoyev, including Washington.
Yeah, I think a lot of folks in Washington feel that he's somebody we can deal with, and that it is a. I think that's why Wendy Sherman was there. That's why we've seen Pompeo go beforehand. And so there's this steady stream going in there. But I would like to sort of pivot back, because I think there's also pitfalls for the United States and U.S. policymakers. Yes, there is a tremendous humanitarian need that we need to deal with south of the border, and Uzbekistan is key. Uzbekistan's a strong state in the region as well, and is key. But I also is key partner in stabilizing the area and engaging with the Taliban. But there's also the human rights dimension. And I might want to sort of bump back to Steve here to sort of talk about there's always this careful balance that the U.S. and other Western partners must do between sort of the security and now the humanitarian crisis in the region, but also our need to sort of continue on. This is still one of the most repressive governments around, and so. What recommendations do you have, and how do we deal with, how should U.S. policymakers be approaching this careful balance that they need to do?
Yeah, and just, to link the internal human rights to the foreign policy discussion you're having, it should be noted that, the evacuation efforts for refugees, asylum seekers, while they are proceeding apace, there are also, some concerns that, as with other areas of reform in Uzbekistan, there's a lack of a legal framework that really respects human rights. So, for example, Uzbekistan hasn't, throughout this period of the Taliban takeover and all these discussions and all these evacuation efforts, which are really laudable, there's been no sign that Uzbekistan is preparing to sign the Refugee Convention, which would normalize and regularize the procedures for those thousands of people that are going to continue to seek help. And there are some concerns that even though Uzbekistan has been taking people in, that people could be returned to Afghanistan, as we've seen earlier, this in the late summer, 150 people or so. In addition to those that have been saved, I want to emphasize that. But, turning back to the media issues and the human rights recommendations, I'm concerned that, as Jen mentioned this, we don't see NGOs getting registered. We still see the Justice Ministry taking a very predictable approach to blocking critical groups from registering, although we have seen some exceptions. We saw one group that tried to get registration 19 times, finally got it in the last month or so. A volunteer youth association doing great work in Uzbekistan. But by and large, the organizations that are trying to work on these critical issues that I think would strengthen the reform process have not had that voice, and that should concern us. The other area of legal reform, I think, on media and on the criminal justice system, we also see this resistance to change. We see a criminal code which still looks largely the way it did in the Karimov period and gives the government an opportunity to imprison people on politically motivated charges, the so-called religious extremism statutes that I was referring to earlier. And then on media, we've seen in the past year, again, a backsliding. We've seen laws introduced to strengthen penalties for the so-called insult of the president. We've seen tightening of restrictions on public disturbances and the holding of meetings, protests, association, and assembly. These are things that go to the core reforms of freedom of media, association, expression, and assembly. And I really believe that given all these potentials, the potential instability, the continued potential for social unrest, the onset of yet another cold winter that we will see with perhaps, gas and electricity shortages and forced eviction issues coming to the surface, there needs to be a legal framework that allows for civil society to function. Otherwise, I think there's just this inherent problem in that system. And as you said, Paul, things remain, unfortunately, they remain authoritarian. So I think that really needs to stay in the center of all the conversations, that without that high level, really, straightforward and frank discussion with Uzbekistan about authoritarianism, that core issue remains unsolved and needs to be addressed.
Okay.
I would just add to this very briefly. The Taliban had a delegation in Tashkent last weekend. And as a result of that, they announced several working committees. We can talk about Tashkent's relationship with the Taliban in a second. But they announced that electricity flows would continue. This was sort of one of the most important announcements that came out. And I'm thinking, well, who's paying for this? I actually asked on social media, nobody could answer the question. Who's paying for this? Before it was the United States that was paying for this electricity transmission. They were subsidizing the Afghan budget. Was it the United States directly? The United States was subsidizing like 70% of the Afghan economy. So the U.S. was paying for this, either directly or indirectly. So now that the U.S. is no longer supporting that government, who's paying this bill? And that electricity has been vital to Afghanistan. Uzbekistan's electricity powers Kabul. So the Taliban have a real incentive to keep that going. And Uzbekistan doesn't want an unstable Afghanistan, has an incentive to keep that going. But we're facing a long, cold winter, as Steve said. If Uzbekistan is exporting electricity at the expense of domestic electricity production, it's going to be a hard winter. And these are really hard questions that I think that the government's going to have to address.
Yeah, and I think, you know, we're seeing in neighboring countries blackouts and concerns already, and so I think, you know, we're seeing global energy prices and electricity prices spiking, and you know, given the sort of the socioeconomic difficulties, this brings it back, you know, to something I was thinking about a little bit earlier, and I think Jen mentioned this. You know, that, and maybe Nabahar too, that, you know, there's a lot of hope about this election, you know, up till about a year ago. I would also say on the media freedom, there was, I mean, I remember hosting a panel about media freedom in Uzbekistan, maybe about a year and a half ago, right before the pandemic. And it looked a lot more promising than it is, you know, today. So I really do wonder, you know, how much of the events of the last, you know, 2 years, sort of the pandemic, what you've seen in Belarus, you know, the sort of the economic and the political upheaval, you know, just south of the border. You know, I wonder, you know, how these other issues are impacting things like media freedom and the human rights agenda. We had another question that came in, and I'm going to just read it, or read bits of it. It's talking about you know, officials who are, you know, abusing their office, they're abusing constituents, they're harassing journalists. We have the, you know, the Tashkent mayor who's done this, you know, Deputy Prime Minister Ghaniyem who's done this, and this at times seems to be actually, you know, almost in defiance of what Mirziyoyev is saying should be happened. He talks about how he won't tolerate these behaviors, but these people are still out there doing it. So what does that sort of say about, you know, Mirziyoyev's promises, but also what does it also say about these people and how important they are to Mirziyoyev and you know, his hold on power, because they seem to be, you know, other people have gone, but some of them seem to be untouchable, including some of the worst abusers out there. So I'd be interested in actually everyone's thoughts on that. I see both Steve and Nabahar, you know, thinking directly, but I also see the other two as well. So I open it up to whoever wants to take that.
You know, when I asked Governor Ghaniyem about that, I said, you've done so many things to your people. You have said so many horrible things, you know, in public, and people hate you. Like they really hate you, and you're still here sitting in front of me governing this region. Why do you think President Mirziyoyev has not fired you yet? You know what he said? He said, because I deliver. Very confidently, he said, because I deliver. Because I deliver what President Mirziyoyev wants from me. And you hear a similar answer from Mayor Artur Khajayev. They know that they're useful for President. They know that they are useful for his agenda. And I think probably one of the most remarkable things about this, you know, re-election campaign for Mirziyoyev, when he's interacting with people, many are not hiding their dissatisfaction with the system he's sitting on top. They're expressing their grievances, and we get this through this, you know, presidential press services, through other journalists, and I'm in touch with many journalists who are covering president, and they say, oh my God, he's hearing so much complaint about, you know, from the region. So one, you know, in many ways, Uzbeks now know more about their local leaders. They know who to go to solve their issues. But now, but even after 5 years, the verdict is the government authorities are still not serving us. You promised us 5 years ago that the government should serve, you know, the people. And great, we love what you say, and there have been a lot of progress, but we are still not getting our problems solved through our local governments. We still need your support to get our village roads paved, you know? We still need your support to get a new restroom for our schools. That's what they say. So when President Mirziyoyev meets these voters and they're telling him, you know, we need a library in our neighborhood, what does that say to President Mirziyoyev? If he's really being, you know, analytical about this, he must be realizing that he's still governing a country where everything is dependent on him. Mm-hmm. Everything needs his attention. That means systemic reforms are not really happening, you know, or maybe they're really happening at a very slow pace. So in many ways, it's a reality check for President Mirziyoyev. Regarding press freedom, there are so many discussions in Tashkent and across the country about those issues. You know, we just completed our agency, U.S. Agency for Global Media, we completed a year-long training program. We engaged nearly 150 journalists around the country. Journalists are discussing, journalists are more confident, despite the fact that they still feel pressure and harassment time to time. They're ready, they're more capable to fight for themselves now. The professionalization of media is happening, yes, not very, not as quickly as we all want, but there are those discussions. And on a day-to-day basis, journalists are in better touch with each other. There is some level of, camaraderie and mutual support. So there, I hope, those trends will continue. And I think many journalists by now realize that they have to be able to fight for themselves and they need to be able to fight for each other. So, professional solidarity and all those issues are being discussed. And that, and the challenge is to maintain the improved quality of Uzbek language journalism. I think that's been a progress, but we need to really continue to build on that. And that's something that I think journalists really need to be very hardworking and aware about in the coming years.
Steve, do you want to weigh in?
Yeah, just real quick. I was going to say that. Sorry, there's a little bit of an echo. I agree with Nabahor about the need for systemic changes, and I think not to be too tongue-in-cheek about it, but one thing that Shavkat Mirziyoyev delivered on was actually delivering cotton pickers to the fields, forcing them to pick cotton a few years back, and was still promoted in the system. And this is an area where the president has, actually that's one area, of course, where we can praise Uzbekistan wholeheartedly in making a lot of progress in reducing forced labor. But even those egregious sorts of abuses from this individual, and then turning to the mayor, she mentioned in the question, Paul, it's about priorities. It's about what is more important, human rights and political reform or delivery of economic objectives. Because I think it was yesterday or the day before that Mirziyoyev addressed why Artik Khajayev is still in his position. And he said, on предприниматель, he's a businessman. And that's the most important thing, is business, business, business. And this is someone that regularly insults journalists and ordinary citizens with absolutely outlandish statements. And he's not the mayor of, Andijan or Fergana. He is the mayor of Tashkent. This is about choices. It's about, I think it is about, it says something about the commitment to reform. And even to get a little bit more serious in terms of officials, I would say, I think what troubles me even more maybe than these statements and these stunts that we sometimes see is that when torture occurs in Uzbekistan, it's very rare that police officers actually get sentenced. And if they do get sentenced, we still have a criminal code that allows them to be amnestied. And even beyond that, some of the people responsible for the worst abuses at the top of the system, like the former head of the security services, Rustam Minoyatov, there's been no prosecutions, no discussions of that kind of reform. So I think when it comes to accountability, those discussions, again, have to be at top of mind. And Paul, I thank you for highlighting media freedom. I should have said this before, but we need to see anyone that's in prison on politically motivated charges released. And there are still politically motivated cases, not just religious prisoners, but also a handful of political cases that have to be addressed.
Ken.
Yeah, and I would just say that what I think that we're seeing is a government that's not as well organized as, there's a lot of incoherence in what we're seeing. The president says one thing and does another, makes proud, loud proclamations and does something else. Administrative reforms, economic reforms tries to push through and faces resistance within ministries. So his power, I don't want to say it's not consolidated, but it's certainly not what it was under the previous president, which is not a bad thing, right? And so there's this real, there's this incoherence, there's this, there's a word I can't, but contradictions within the government. And unless this is really addressed, it's going to be hard for these reforms to go very far.
Wonderful. Thanks, Jen. We are almost at time, so I wanted to give each panelist a 1 minute, limit of 1 minute to talk about what, over the next 5 years, what we assume to be Mirziyoyev's second term in the presidency, what should we be one or two issues that we should be tracking that are going to be challenges or opportunities for the country in the coming term. So I'll turn to Navbahor first.
I was at a discussion today about anti-corruption efforts in Uzbekistan and, human rights issues, torture, and other fundamental problems that Uzbekistan has to deal with and is still dealing with. And so, come 2022, two things are supposed to happen that the government has been promising for a long time. We must start seeing the disclosure of public servants' financial statements. And it'll be very interesting to watch where in that hierarchy, it will start. Will we see presidential salary? Will we see the income, statements of the high level, Uzbek leaders and where it ends? And then the anti-corruption agency is going to introduce its shaming and naming program, where they will be, putting people's names as corrupt Uzbeks, and will we see the governors? Will we see local leaders? Will we see ministers? Will we see their deputy ministers, right? Or will it just be focused on some mid-level officials? Because anti-corruption efforts so far have really focused on them. So that's where I think public is incredibly curious about. And when I talk to voters, that's what they're basically saying. Let's see what happens, because they have promised us that. So I think Uzbekistan's anti-corruption efforts will really be put on a major test there. That is something that I will also be watching, and journalists, I'm sure, who cover Uzbekistan will be watching very closely. And of course, the economic situation. I mean, somebody here asked about energy prices. Uzbeks spend 1/3 of their income on energy every month. So, gasoline is expensive, electricity is expensive, and the salaries remain really low. Now, people realize that a lot should happen for them to have higher salaries. They get it. But still, living is getting harder in Uzbekistan, and in a post-pandemic world where people are still not traveling for migrant work, a lot of people are really suffering. So those are the issues. Healthcare, of course, education, and other things. Those are the issues that are really the voters are talking about, and in their minds.
Very much bread and butter issues. Steve. We just have a few minutes left, so please.
One or two sentences.
Yeah, real quick. Uzbekistan became a member of the Human Rights Council earlier this year, and if that membership, is important to the government, which it says it is, what I'm going to be looking towards are these core issues of reforming the criminal code, taking out the most repressive aspects of the system. NGO registration, as Jen has said, civil society is at the core of this. We need civil society in order to see success going forward. And maybe most interesting, and the least spoken about recently, but to me the most important indicator of possible success is gender rights and the representation of women in politics. We still see, and Navbahor often speaks about this, no women in politics, other than, of course, chairwoman of the Senate, Tanzila Narbayeva. But we need to see that. I think I'll be watching to see if there are any moves to open the political space for women and women's rights in general in Uzbekistan.
Timur, a few sentences on what we should be watching.
I think for Uzbekistan it will be very important when it comes to foreign affairs not to fall too closely with any of its international partners, to keep these multilateral foreign policy, and to keep this distance, and to have limits, certain limits for each country. And the second one is for Uzbek government to listen to its society when it comes to foreign policy, and to not ignore what people are thinking about the future relations of Uzbekistan with other countries in the world. Thank you.
Last but not least, Jen.
Very briefly, I think we're going to see new major players in the government, probably a new foreign minister, new prime minister. That's kind of the things that we're hearing. But also, I wouldn't be surprised to see major governance and public administration reforms to get all the bread and butter things done that Navbahor spoke about. I think that has to happen. And I'm hearing whispers about that kind of thing. And second, I think we see a very confident Uzbekistan in terms of its foreign policy, its relationship with its neighbors, its relationship with the great powers. It has power. it's really set itself up. It's not even thinking about Kazakhstan. It's thinking about itself. It's very confident.
True. Ed, do you have any final thoughts too about what you think we should be tracking, or what you find interesting?
No, I think everyone's summed it up nicely. We're at time, so I'll get back to you to conclude.
Well, I want to thank all 5 of you, Timur, Jen, Nabahar, Ed, and Steve. This has been a really good conversation. I've learned a lot, and I thought we've had a really good give and take. I want to thank all of you for being with us today. I also want to thank a few people who are behind the scenes. At USC, University of Southern California, we had Mia Spire and Bennett Ryan, who really did a great job in helping promote this event. We have our wonderful Tanya Pyak at Carnegie, who has been really an incredible, right hand for all of us working here. And we also have our Carnegie communications crew that was made sure that we could stream this live, and we appreciate all of their efforts in making this happen. And we appreciate also Nabahar staying up late in Tashkent.
No, it's okay. I'm still at work, and thank you, Oxus and Carnegie, for bringing us together. This was a pleasure and wonderful. I'm so happy we didn't get disconnected.
Yeah, great.
The Wi-Fi quality is improving steadily.
Great. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.